worship service and parish product. We have several out today because of illness, but it's good to see all of you here this morning with us. We have our family day coming up in 2 weeks, and Jessica has prepared some postcards for us to use to invite family and friends. So you can grab some of these, send them through the mail, of course, or hand them out. September 30th. And Rob lets us know that the theme for the fellowship meal will be Italian. So prepare something Italian and stay with us that day for a fellowship meal to enjoy the time together. Our congregation in the last 3 months or so has had a number of, or at least several in the church family has had a number of, received a number of different types of bad news. Some of us have had surgeries, pretty serious surgeries, potentially life-threatening surgeries. Of course, diagnosis of cancer, being laid off, looking for a job, permanent job, something good, something that pays decent. How do we handle bad news? How do we handle the pain of life? Sometimes it's easy to become cynical and pessimistic. Sometimes it's easy to become bitter, to become envious of somebody else because they're having it good and we're not. Sometimes it's easy to become angry at the lot in life that we have, the deck in life we've been dealt, the card we've been dealt. In Psalm 102, the psalmist also deals with struggles. And he gives us some keys to dealing with those struggles. And so I want us to study Psalm 102 this morning. Turning your Bibles to Psalm 102. If you're using the Bible in the pew, it's page 501. But how do we handle these problems in life? Mark Twain wrote, "Life does not consist mainly or even largely of facts or happenings. It consists mainly of storms of thoughts that is forever flowing through one's head." Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever been in a situation where there's just been a rush of different thoughts and feelings go through your head or through your heart, and you might even feel like you're in something of a tornado or a whirlwind, wanting to say, "God, just stop the merry-go-round and let me get off." Let's see how the psalmist, and we don't know who wrote the psalm, so throughout the lesson I might tend to refer to David as the author. He doesn't identify himself. But let's see what the psalmist says about the struggles that he endured. Now notice first of all verses 1 and 2 that we read just a moment ago, and count the number of times that the psalmist cries out to God to answer his prayer. God, give me an answer. Now, have you ever felt like that? God's ignoring me. Now, we as parents, if we call for our child to answer us, to come to the kitchen or whatever, and they don't say anything, we get upset. And the psalmist is wanting God, give me an answer. He says, "Hear my prayer, O Lord, and let my cry for help come to you." Notice he recognizes that God doesn't even have to answer the prayer to begin with. Let my cry come before you. Please allow my petition to get higher than the ceiling. The verse 2, "Do not hide your face from me in the day of my distress. Incline your ear to me in the day when I call. Answer me quickly." So I have counted 5 different ways that the psalmist is asking God to listen to his prayer. Listen to me. God, nobody else can help. Nobody else is in a position to help me. Incline your ear to me and listen. And in verses 3 through 11, he kind of gives a description of what he's going through. Look at what he says in verse 3. Why do I want God to listen to me? Because, or for, my days have been consumed in smoke, and my bones have been scorched like a hearth. So he feels like his life is on its way to its end. He feels like life is too short, or maybe even the happiness that he enjoyed was too short. Things have turned bad for him. And they're bad for him physically, where he says, my bones have been scorched like a hearth. We don't know what he's dealing with physically, but he feels like he's on fire on the inside. He says in verse 4, my heart has been smitten like grass and is withered away. I don't have any heart left. Now tonight in our lesson, we're going to look at Caleb. Joshua's Caleb. And see how Caleb was able to have courage to go on in his life. But the psalmist says, I don't have any courage. My heart is gone. Indeed, he says, I forget to eat my bread. Have you ever been so distressed that you can't eat? And we go through that sometimes, don't we? Something very stressful happens to us, and we just don't feel like eating. And what happens if we go through that several days in a row or several weeks in a row? We just get smaller and smaller. We get weaker and weaker. And when our physical bodies get weaker, then our mental body gets weaker as well, because there's a close connection between the two. And then in verse 5 he says, because of the loudness of my groaning, my bones cling to my flesh. Now that's what happened because he hasn't been eating. Now you can count his ribs. A grown man, you can count his ribs. He can't eat because he's so stressed. God, listen to me. I can't go on. There's no one else who can help me solve the problems that I have in my life. Look what he says in verses 6 and 7. He says, I resemble a pelican of the wilderness. That's how the New American Standard translates it. Your translation might have an owl, because we don't know exactly what the Hebrew word here is, or what animal it refers to. But if you go based on the New American Standard translating as a pelican, then we get the picture. A pelican in the wilderness? Do pelicans live in the wilderness? They don't, do they? They're aquatic birds. So when he says, I resemble a pelican in the wilderness, I've become an owl of the waste places, what he's saying is, I feel like a fish out of water. I don't belong here. I don't belong in this position. I don't belong in this life. I need something better, something different. I lie awake and I become like a lonely bird on a housetop. You see, that's what he's saying. I feel out of place. There's nobody who can help me, God. I need some answers. In verse 8, he tells us that his problems are not just physical problems. His problems are also external. I've got enemies. I've got people who would love to see my destruction. I've got people who love to walk over me. People who don't care anything about me. And the world, of course, is full of people who don't care about others. He says, my enemies have reproached me all day long. Those who deride me have used my name as a curse. For I have eaten ashes like bread and mingled my drink with weeping. Think about that. Hank Williams Jr. had that song, there's a tear in my Kool-Aid or tea or something like that, didn't he say? So he's drinking the tears that he's shedding because his heart is broken. How much he's hurting inside. Now, verse 10 shows us that he feels like God is behind it. He says, because of your indignation and your wrath, for you have lifted me up and cast me away. So despite the fact that he has faith in God, verses 1 and 2, he is also like you and I are sometimes. God, are you punishing me? Have I done something wrong, God? If I have, if you're punishing me because of sin, open my eyes and let me know, so I can say I'm sorry. So he feels like he's at the receiving end of God's anger and God's wrath. And in verse 11, he says, my days are like a lengthened shadow, and I wither away like grass. So the psalmist does not see the light at the end of the tunnel. He sees a tunnel at the end of life. And he doesn't know how to get through it. And he needs help. He needs to find strength from somebody. And of course that somebody is God. And the good thing is that despite the fact that he doesn't know how God is going to answer, he still has his faith in God. He still believes that God hears and answers prayer. And that's what the rest of the psalm is about. Because if you look at verse 12, the very beginning of verse 12 is emphatic, and especially in the original Hebrew. But you, O Lord, there's the answer. There's the solution. Turning away from self and turning back to God. So often we become discouraged and we become pessimistic about things in life because we turn our eyes off of God and we turn them back on ourselves. And we realize, I can't get through this. And God is always standing there saying, I know you can't. I designed you where you can't get through it on your own. I designed you to turn back to me. So that's what the psalmist has done in verses 1 and 2. He has prayed to God. He has recognized his own weaknesses, and that's what he's been doing, verses 3 through 11. But then he turns his attention back to God. And notice what he recognizes about God's character, God's nature, verse 12. But you, O Lord, abide forever, and your name to all generations. Right there, he's reminding himself that God never changes. God is always there. He doesn't mention it here, but it may be that he thinks about the promises that God has given and fulfilled in Israel's past. How God took care of Adam and Eve despite their sin. He kicked them out of the Garden of Eden, yes, but he stayed with them. And how he stayed with Noah and his family on the ark. And how he stayed with Abraham and walked through life with Abraham. And how he stayed with the great King David despite his sins. If this is not David. But he reminds himself of God's nature and how God's name lasts from one generation to the next. And in verse 13, he reminds himself of what God has done, his actions. He says, you will arise and have compassion on Zion, for it is time to be gracious to her, for the appointed time has come. Now, looking at those thoughts there about the city of Zion, which of course is a reference to the city of Jerusalem, it might be that the psalmist has experienced that exile in Babylon that has lasted for 70 years. Or it might be right about that time. But anyway, regardless, he's concerned about his city of Jerusalem. And he says, God, you've turned your attention back to Jerusalem, or back to Zion, and it's time now to be gracious to her, for you have set an appointed time. Now think about that. If God allows bad things to happen to us to create character in us, whether it's courage He's wanting to develop in us, or whether it's patience, or whether it's love for a fellow man, or whatever it is, if God allows these things to happen to help us grow and mature and be more like Christ, and I think the Bible teaches that, then God also knows the right time to bring it to an end. Doesn't Paul promise in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13 that God will not put on us something too great that we cannot bear? Well, if that's the case, then God also knows when the time is over. We as parents, when we are disciplining our children in whatever way we're disciplining them, we have a set time when we stop, because we know that if we become overbearing on them, then we'll discourage them and we'll take away the very motivation for them to be better. God has the same motivation, the same understanding. And so David here says in verse 13, the time has come to take away this reproach that we feel, this discouragement that I'm going through, and to provide an answer of grace. And then in verse 14, he gives the reasons for God's actions. Surely your servants find pleasure in her stones and feel pity for her dust. What's